Pull up a chair and dim the light. Leave your worries at the door tonight. No need to whisper, no need to hide. We're all chasing shadows side by side. Southern moon and candle flame. Every ghost has another name. Haunted halls and forgotten dreams. Nothing's ever quite what it seems. Old photographs and dusty frames. Everybody's got stories they can't explain. Somewhere in the quiet between heartbeats, wonder waits for those who see. Did you hear it? Did you see? Tell me what you believe. Was it fate? Was it fear? Or something drawing you near? Curiosity after dark, where we wander through the strange. Every question leaves a mark. Nothing ever stays the same. Ghost stories under midnight skies. Old legends pass through lullabies. Take my hand and lose the fear. Wonder's always welcome here. Curiosity after dark, where restless hearts belong. Searching shadows for a spark, finding wonder in the unknown. Haunted mansions dressed in lace. Footsteps echo through empty space. Vampire myths and whispered lore. 100 secrets behind one door. Disney ghosts and phantom brides. Truth and fiction intertwined. The things we fear, the things we seek, have a funny way of making us believe. True crime headlines and unsolved names. The monsters hiding in familiar frames. The world is stranger than we know, and that's exactly why we go. Stories pass from friend to friend. Questions without easy ends. Somewhere between doubt and faith, we keep searching anyway. Tell me your stories, tell me your fears. Tell me the things you've carried for years. What's in the darkness? What have you seen? Tell me what keeps you wondering. Curiosity after dark, where we wander through the strange. Every question leaves a mark. Nothing ever stays the same. Ghost stories under midnight skies. Old legends pass through lullabies. Take my hand and lose the fear. Wonder is always welcome here. Curiosity after dark, where restless hearts belong. Searching shadows for a spark, finding wonder in the unknown. Maybe monsters wear familiar faces. Maybe angels leave no traces. Maybe every legend starts with someone asking, what if? Maybe myths and memories pass through generations quietly. Maybe truth is stranger still, waiting just beyond the hill. Maybe the things that keep us awake are the questions we were born to chase. Maybe wonder never dies, it just opens different eyes. So tell me what haunts you. Tell me what fascinates you. Tell me the stories you swore were true. Tell me what made you look twice. We'll talk about ghosts and graveyards, about creatures hidden in folklore, about the darkness in humanity and the beauty of not knowing. No judgment here, no need to convince anyone. You don't have to have the answers, just curiosity. Curiosity after dark, where we wander through the strange. Every question leaves a mark. Nothing ever stays the same. Ghost stories under midnight skies. The legends pass through lullabies. another story waiting to be told. Welcome to Curiosity After Dark.
All right, hello guys, and we are going to cover one of my favorite topics tonight. And I hope you're excited because I spent a lot of time on this, a lot of time. I did do some research, some new research, just because it's been a while since I actually did any research on my favorite topic. But tonight, on the second episode of Curiosity After Dark, we will be covering, of course, vampires. Alright, so... Okay, sorry about that. Alright, so... when most people think or hear the word vampire, they immediately think of Dracula, right? Maybe they picture Castlevania, Buffy, Anne Rice, and Astarion, or whatever version of vampires first introduced them to the genre. Funny thing is, none of these are actually where the story begins. The vampire is much older than Dracula. It's older than Bram Stoker. It's older than the castles in Transylvania. It's older than Christianity. In fact, if you start tracing the history of vampires backwards, eventually you'll reach a point where the creature doesn't even resemble what we call a vampire today. There are no fangs, no coffins, no capes, no bats, no dramatic entrances through bedroom windows. Instead, you'll find people trying to explain things they didn't understand. One of the most interesting discoveries I made while researching this episode is that there isn't one singular origin point for the vampire. There isn't a point where one person invents the idea and everyone else copies it. Instead, cultures from all over the world develop their own stories about creatures that fed upon the living, returned from the dead, or somehow stole life from others. They often look different. They behaved differently. They existed in different religious and cultural traditions, yet they all seem to circle around the same fears. That alone is fascinating to me because, my psychology degree. These cultures were separated by geography, language, religion, and in some cases, thousands of years of history. Yet many of them arrived at remarkably similar conclusions about what might happen if the dead refused to stay dead. Some of the earliest examples come from ancient Mesopotamia, located in what is now modern-day Iraq. Mesopotamia is often called the cradle of civilization because it gave rise to some of the world's earliest cities, systems of writing, and organized governments. It also gave us some of our earliest supernatural creatures. Among them were beings that were known as Lilitus. I think I'm pronouncing that right. If not, forgive me. I know it sounds a lot like Lilith, but that's a whole nother thing. Depending on the source, these spirits were associated with disease, death, misfortune, seduction, miscarriages, and death of infants. Modern scholars still debate exactly how closely they should be connected to later vampire traditions, but they represent something that appears again and again throughout vampire folklore: the attempt to explain tragedy. Sorry. It's difficult for us to fully appreciate how terrifying the ancient world can be. Today, if someone becomes ill, we generally expect an explanation. We have doctors, hospitals, and centuries of scientific knowledge. Ancient people had none of that. Children died from illnesses that could easily be treatable today. Women died during childbirth. Actually, still happens today. Epidemics could devastate an entire community. When there was no clear explanation for these events, people naturally searched for one. Stories often filled the gaps where knowledge could not. As we move into ancient Greece, the connection between tragedy and monsters becomes clear. One of the most famous examples is Lamia, a figure whose story survives in several different forms. According to the most common version of the myth, Lamia was a queen who became involved with Zeus. Clearly, if you know anything about Greek mythology, if Zeus gets involved with anybody, it ends badly for that person. Hera, of course, discovered the affair and punished Lamia by taking her children from her. The details vary depending on the source, but the outcome remains the same. Lamia is consumed by grief and eventually transformed into something monstrous. Now, later stories describe her preying upon children and feeding upon the living. Some traditions even associate her with drinking blood. Whether these details were present in the earliest versions of the myth is still debated, but what matters for our discussion is that we can already see themes that will continue to appear throughout vampire history. Transformation. The corruption of something that was once human. The Greeks also gave us another interesting figure known as Imperza. Unlike Lamia, Imperza is often described as a shapeshifter capable of appearing beautiful in order to lure victims towards their doom. This introduces another element that would become central to vampire mythology: temptation. One of the most defining characteristics of the modern vampire is that it rarely relies on brute force alone. Vampires persuade, they charm, they seduce, they convince people to lower their guard. Long before Dracula ever appeared in a novel, stories have already explored the frightening idea that danger may arrive wearing a friendly face. What makes these early myths so interesting is that they don't give us a vampire, they give us pieces of one. The vampire we recognize today doesn't fully appear fully formed, right? It evolved over centuries, absorbing ideas from different cultures and different traditions. Ancient Mesopotamia contributed fears surrounding disease and unexplained death. Greece contributed themes of transformation, temptation, and predation. Other cultures would continue adding to their own pieces of the puzzle. And this is where the story becomes a little more interesting, because the creature begins to move east and north through Europe, where we start seeing what fully resembles a vampire that we know today. As folklore spread through Eastern Europe, the creature began to take on a form that feels much more familiar to modern audiences. This is where we encounter stories of corpses rising from their graves, feeding upon the living, and spreading misfortune throughout their communities. Many historians point to Slavic folklore as one of the most important foundations for the modern vampire, and it is here where we begin finding some traditions that survive all the way to modern fiction. One of the earliest terms associated with these creatures is upir, a word that appears in various forms throughout Eastern Europe. Unlike the elegant vampires of modern novels and television shows, these creatures were not seductive aristocrats. They were frightening. They were often described as swollen, discolored corpses that somehow returned from the grave. To modern readers, these descriptions can seem strange, but they make much more sense when viewed through the lens of decomposition. Sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied. Most people throughout history have very little understanding of what happens to the human body after death. If a grave was opened weeks or even months after burial, the corpse often does not look the way people expect it to. Gases produced during decomposition can cause the body to swell, blood may collect around the mouth and nose, hair and fingernails appear longer as the skin recedes. To modern forensic science, these are completely natural processes. To people living centuries ago, they could look at this evidence as the corpse somehow still being active. This helps explains why so many vampire traditions focus on preventing the dead from returning. In many regions, becoming a vampire had very little to do with being bitten. Instead, it was believed that certain circumstances surrounding a person's life or death could lead to vampirism. Somebody who died violently, someone who was denied a proper burial or even burial rites, someone who was viewed as an outsider, or someone who simply died under unusual circumstances might be suspected of returning after death. The fear was not simply that a vampire might attack you. The fear was that natural order itself had been disrupted. Death was supposed to be final. Burial was supposed to bring peace. A vampire represented something that had gone wrong. This belief led to a wide variety of anti-vampire practices, some of which survive in popular culture today. Most famous is a stake through the heart. Most audiences often think of staking as a method of killing vampires largely because of stories like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Historically, however, the purpose was often much simpler. The stake was intended to pin the corpse to the earth and prevent it from rising again. Different regions preferred different woods. Hawthorn appears in some traditions, while ash and oak appear in others. The exact type mattered less than the underlying goal, keeping the dead where they belonged. Other methods were even more extreme. Suspected vampires were often decapitated. In certain regions, stones or bricks were placed in the mouths of the deceased to prevent them from feeding. Some bodies were placed face down under the belief that they might attempt to rise, that they would be digging in the wrong direction. Archaeologists have discovered graves containing many of these practices, reminding us that these beliefs were not just simply stories. People generally acted upon them. Even the famous vampire weaknesses have roots in this period. Garlic, for example, was associated with protection and health long before it became connected to vampires. Because it's believed to ward off illness, it gradually became linked to supernatural protection as well. The cross entered vampire lore as Christianity spread through Eastern Europe and merged with existing folklore. The vampire became associated with corruption and the violation of natural order, while the cross represents divine authority and protection. One detail that often surprises modern audiences is that not all of the famous vampire weaknesses are equally old. Silver, for example, is far more closely connected to werewolf traditions than vampire traditions. Over time, supernatural folklore began borrowing ideas from itself, and many stories eventually treated silver as a weakness for almost every creature imaginable. Historically, however, its connection to vampires is much weaker than people realize. Perhaps the most interesting thing about these traditions is how seriously they were taken. Today, we view them as folklore. To the people living at the time, they were practical solutions to a real threat. Communities were not performing anti-vampire rituals because they enjoyed telling ghost stories. They were attempting to protect their families and neighbors from something they believed generally existed. This is also where we start to see the shift from a supernatural one to a culture one. The creature became a way of enforcing social expectations. Proper burials mattered. Religious rights matter. Community acceptance matters. The vampire often emerged from these expectations were violated. In many ways, the vampire became a warning of what could happen when society's rules were ignored. While Eastern Europe was developing these traditions, other parts of the world were creating their own versions of the restless dead. Some looked remarkably similar to the European vampires. However, others looked completely different. Yet, despite these differences, many of them reflected the same underlying fear that death may not always be the end of the story. One of the best examples of this can be found in China, where stories have developed about a creature that modern audiences often refer to as the hopping vampire. Although it differs slightly to European vampire, it demonstrates just how widespread humanity's fascination with the undead truly is. The Chinese creature is often compared to a vampire that it's called a jiangshi. While the comparison is useful, it's important to remember that a jiangshi is not simply a Chinese version of Dracula. Like many of the creatures we've discussed so far, it developed within its own cultural and religious traditions. What makes it fascinating is how it arrives at some of the ideas while taking a very different path. A jiangshi is typically described as a reanimated corpse that moves with stiff hopping motions. Traditional artwork often depicts it wearing clothing of a deceased government official, with its arms extended in front of it as it moves through the night. Unlike European vampires, jiangshi does not usually drink blood. Instead, they are said to drain the life force of the living, or their chi. Despite the difference, the core fear remains surprisingly familiar. Once again, the dead have returned and are feeding upon the living. Many jiangshi stories are connected to improper burial practices, spiritual imbalance, or bodies that have not been laid to rest correctly. At this point, a pattern should become obvious. Whether we're discussing Eastern Europe or China, many undead traditions emerge from the belief that something was interrupted between the natural relationship of life and death. India provides another fascinating example through stories of the Vitala. These beings appear in ancient Hindu folklore and often are described as spirits that inhabit corpses. Unlike many of the creatures we've discussed so far, Vitala is not always presented as purely evil. Is not represented as purely evil. In some stories, it behaves more like a supernatural trickster. It challenges kings, presents riddles, and forces people to confront difficult and moral questions. What interests me about the Vitala is that it demonstrates how flexible undead folklore can be. Not every culture imagined the restless dead as simple predators. Sometimes they become teachers, manipulators, or mirrors reflecting human behavior back upon itself. Even here, however, the same theme persists. The dead is still interacting with the living. The boundary between the two worlds remains uncertain. The Philippines offers some of the most unsettling examples of vampire-like creatures anywhere in folklore. The most famous is the Aswang, a creature that exists in many different forms depending on the region and the story being told. Some versions appear almost completely human, while some versions appear almost completely human during the day before hunting at night. Sorry, I was reading my notes and skipped a line. Others are associated with blood, flesh, and predation. Being a predator. Among the many variants of the Aswang is a creature known as the Menatogna, Kalga, Menanog. I can't pronounce this to save my life. But according to legend, it appears as an ordinary woman during the day. At night, however, its upper body separates from its lower half, wings emerge, and it takes flight in search of victims. Stories often connected to pregnant women and unborn children, making it one of the most feared creatures in Philippine folklore. While examining these traditions, it becomes clear that the vampire-like creatures are not just limited to one region, one religion, or one culture. They appear again and again throughout human history. The details vary dramatically, but the underlying concerns often remain the same. Disease, death, burial, family survival, and fear of forces beyond human understanding appear remarkably consistent. The more I researched these stories, the less interested I became in finding the verse vampire. I don't think there is one. Instead, what we find are countless communities trying to answer difficult questions using the tools available to them. Folklore became one of the ways of understanding the world that often seemed unpredictable and frightening. What makes this especially interesting is that many of these traditions developed independently. Ancient Mesopotamia was not sharing stories with the Philippines. Greek mythology and its traditions were not being exchanged with Chinese folklore. Yet all of them produce creatures connected to the dead, to draining of life, or to the disruption of natural order. Whether that reflects universal human fears or something deeper is a question I'll leave y'all to decide. At this point of the story, however, we have been talking about entire folklore. We've discussed myths, legends, spirits, and monsters. We're going to now get into where these stop just being stories. People started to look at real life events and convincing themselves they find evidence of vampires actually existing. This transition is one of the most important developments in vampire history because it transforms the vampire from a mythological creature to something that's a supposed explanation of real tragedies. The culprit behind the transformation was not magic, curses, or the supernatural. It was disease. And as strange as it sounds, some of the most famous vampire stories often begin with a medical mystery. One of the biggest mistakes we can make when we're looking back on historic vampire panic is assuming that the people involved were really foolish. It's easy to laugh at stories about communities digging up graves in search of vampires because we already know the answers that they were missing. We understand disease. We understand infection. We understand decomposition. The people living through these events, however, did not. In many cases, vampire folklore became intertwined with a disease known as tuberculosis, or back then called consumption. Before modern medicine, tuberculosis was one of the most feared illnesses in the world. It spread slowly, often within families, and the symptoms were frightening. The victims became pale, weak, and noticeably thinner over time. They frequently appeared exhausted, lost weight, and in advanced stages could cough up blood. Imagine watching this happen without knowing anything about bacteria or infection. One family member becomes ill and dies. Then another slowly begins showing the same symptoms, and then another. The disease seems to move from person to person, draining strength and life as it spreads through the household. To modern medicine, this is an infectious disease. To someone living in the 18th or 19th century, it could easily look at something feeding upon the living. What makes matters worse were the condition of the bodies themselves when they were exhumed. Most folks expect a corpse to decay quickly and dramatically. In reality, decomposition can be influenced by temperature, moisture, soil conditions, and countless other factors. Under the right circumstances, a body could remain surprisingly well preserved for an extended period of time. When these graves were opened, people sometimes discovered the corpses that appeared swollen instead of skeletal. Blood might be visible around the mouth, the hair and fingernails seemed longer than they were at burial, internal gases created the appearance of recent activity. Again, these is just modern biological processes. To frighten communities, though, already searching for answers, this looked like evidence. As a result, vampire panics began appearing in both Europe and North America. Communities became convinced that recently deceased relatives were somehow returning from the grave and draining the life from surviving family members. The solution, according to local belief, was to identify the vampire and prevent it from continuing attacks. This is kind of where you'll start to see there's several famous graves that have cages around them, and that was to prevent them from rising. So if they did rise, they couldn't get out of those bars, right? One of the most famous examples of this phenomenon occurred in Rhode Island during the late 19th century, and it involved a young woman named Mercy Brown. Now, she lived in Rhode Island during a period where tuberculosis was devastating communities across New England. Her family was struck particularly hard by the disease. First, her mom died, then her sister. Then eventually she died herself in 1892. When another member of the family, her brother Edwin, began suffering from the same illness, local residents became convinced that something supernatural was occurring. At this point, New England already had a history of vampire beliefs. Stories of the dead returning to harm relatives had circulated through the region for generations. Faced with another apparent victim, the community members turned to the only explanation they knew. The Brown family graves were opened. When Mercy's body was examined, it appeared unusually well preserved. Modern historians generally believe because this was due to the environmental conditions at the time that slowed decomposition. At the time, people viewed this as proof how she was somehow active after death. She died in the winter, so the ground was too cold to bury her, so they actually stored her above ground in a storage, I think in the graveyard, I do believe. And so when they exhumed her body, clearly the temperature kept it well preserved. Well, the response to this was very drastic. Mercy's heart and liver were removed and burned. The ashes were mixed into a tonic that was given to Edwin in hopes that it would cure him. It did not. He died shortly afterwards. The story of Mercy Brown is often remembered as one of the last great vampire panics in American history, but what makes it important is it's not the supposed vampire. It's the desperation behind the accusation. People involved were watching loved ones die from a disease they did not understand. They wanted an explanation. More importantly, they wanted a solution. In many ways, there has always been a role of the vampire. Long before it became a literary character, the vampire served as an answer to questions people could not otherwise answer. Why is my family dying? Why is this disease spreading? Why does tragedy keep finding us? Folklore stepped in when the knowledge ended. Ironically, the period that produced some of the most famous vampire panics also marked the beginning of the vampire's decline as a medical explanation. During the 19th century, scientific understanding of disease advanced dramatically. researchers began identifying bacteria and learning how different illnesses spread. Medicine started providing answers that folklore could not. As science explained more and more of the world, belief in vampires as literal creatures gradually declined. However, the vampire itself did not disappear. Instead, it adapted. Just like ancient folklore had transformed fears about death into monsters, writers began transforming these monsters into stories. By the end of the 19th century, the vampire was about to undergo its greatest evolution yet. The creature that once served as an explanation for disease and death would become one of the most important figures in Gothic literature. Before we get to Dracula, however, we need to discuss two historic figures whose name became permanently attached to vampire mythology: Vlad the Impaler and Elizabeth Bathory. Neither of them are a vampire, both of them are legends, though. Their stories help shape the world into imagining vampires for generations to come. Alright, when discussing vampire history, these two names appear so frequently that many people assume that they must have been direct inspiration for every vampire story that followed. The reality, though, is a little bit more complicated. Both Vlad III and Elizabeth Bathory became associated with vampire mythology long after their lives had ended, and separating historical fact from legend can be surprisingly difficult. Let's start with Vlad, also known as Vlad the Impaler. Vlad was born in the 15th century and ruled a region located in modern-day Romania. He lived during a period of political instability, military conflict, and a constant pressure from the expanding Ottoman Empire. Depending on who is telling the story, Vlad is remembered either as a national hero who defended his homeland or as one of the most brutal rulers in European history. The nickname the Impaler came from his preferred method of execution. Vlad was known for impaling enemies, criminals, and political rivals on large wooden stakes. Contemporary accounts describe fields containing hundreds, sometimes thousands, of impaled bodies. Whether every story is accurate remains a matter of debate. Like many rulers throughout history, Vlad became the subject of both propaganda and exaggeration. His enemies had every reason to portray him as a monster, while his supporters had every reason to celebrate his victories. What's important for our discussion is he was not a vampire. There was no accounts of him drinking blood, transforming into a bat, sleeping in coffins, or exhibiting any of the traits we associate with modern vampires. His connection to vampire mythology comes primarily from Bram Stoker. While researching Eastern European history for Dracula, Stoker encountered the name Dracula, which was associated with Vlad's family. It derives from his father, Vlad II Dracul, a member of the Order of the Dragon. Depending on the context and translation, the word can often carry associations with both dragons and devils. Stoker found the name memorable and used it for his fictional count. That decision created one of the most enduring associations in literary history. Over time, the historical ruler and the fictional vampire became increasingly linked in popular imagination. Today, many people assume Dracula is simply Vlad the Impaler with fangs. In reality, the connection is much smaller than most people realize. Stoker borrowed the name and a few historic details, but the vampire Count Dracula is largely a literary creation. Elizabeth Bathory, however, occupies a very different place in vampire mythology. Born in 1560, Bathory was a Hungarian noblewoman who became one of the most infamous figures in European history. She was accused of torturing and murdering large amounts of young women, and the stories surrounding her became increasingly sensational over time. These accounts claim that she was responsible for hundreds of deaths. The most famous story associated with Bathory is that she bathed in the blood of young women in an attempt to preserve her youth and beauty. It's easy to see why this tale became connected to vampire mythology. Blood, beauty, immortality, and aristocracy are all themes that would later become central to vampire fiction. The problem is that historians are not entirely convinced that this particular story is true. While there are some evidence of terrible things occurring in her household, many modern scholars believe that the blood bathing legend emerged years after her death. Some historians have suggested that political motives may have influenced the accusations against her. Others argue that the truth likely exists somewhere between complete innocence and the more extreme stories that developed later. What makes Bathory important is not whether or not she literally bathed in blood. What matters is the legend it represents. Long before vampire fiction,
Okay, now to be fair.
To be fair.
To be fair.
what is to be fair about Bathory? She bathed in blood, man. Anyway, what matters is that what the legend represents. Long before vampire fiction became obsessed with eternal youth and immortality, stories often connected blood to vitality, beauty, and the fear of aging. When viewed together, Vlad and Bathory contribute different pieces to the evolving image of the vampire. Vlad added the image of the feared Eastern European ruler whose name became synonymous with Dracula. Bathory contributed themes of blood, beauty, and immortality. Neither were a vampire, but yet both became part of the mythology. By the 19th century, centuries of folklore, superstition, historical legends, and vampire panics have created fertile ground for writers. The vampire was no longer just a creature lurking in village folklore. It became a literary figure. Interesting, though, the first major step in that transformation did not come from Bram Stoker. It actually came from a novella published in 1872 called Carmilla. Today, Dracula is often treated as the beginning of vampire culture, but that's not true. 26 years before Stoker introduced his famous count, Sheridan Le Fanu created a vampire who would influence nearly every version that followed. In many ways, Carmilla marks the moment that the vampire stopped being a simple monster and became something far more complicated. So, despite the fact of it being published 26 years before Dracula, a lot of people have never heard of it. To be honest, I didn't even know about it until last year when I read it. So if you ask somebody to name a famous vampire, they're probably going to mention Dracula first, except if you ask me. Don't ask me. Clearly, I know way more. Yet, many of the traits that we associate with modern vampires appear in Carmilla before Stoker ever put pen to paper. This is one of the reasons why I think Carmilla deserves far more attention than it receives. Nosferatu is a ripoff of Dracula, and we'll get to that in a minute. Prior to this point, vampires were often portrayed as grotesque, corpse-like creatures tied closely to folklore. They were something to fear, avoid, and destroy. Carmilla changed that formula. She was intelligent and charming, beautiful, and capable of integrating herself into society. She did not simply attack her victims, she formed relationships with them. She earned their trust. She became part of their lives before revealing her true nature. That may not sound revolutionary to modern audiences, but it was a significant shift in vampire fiction. the vampire became a monster, became less of a monster and more of a just character. One of the most fascinating aspects of Carmilla is how ahead of its time it feels. It was published during the Victorian era, a novella that contains romantic undertones between Carmilla and Laura that readers often at the time would have recognized, even though the subject was very rarely discussed openly. In many ways, Carmilla stands as one of the earliest notable examples of a non-heterosexual character in vampire literature, appearing during a time where these themes were highly controversial. What makes this extra interesting is that the literary vampire's journey does not often begin with a male aristocrat ruling from a castle. This story began with a female vampire whose relationship with her victim is built as much on attraction and emotional intimacy as it is on horror. Many of the themes that would dominate vampire fiction are already present in Carmilla. Hey! What? Sorry. Seduction, desire, temptation, manipulation, the blurring of affection and danger. These ideas would eventually become staples of the genre, appearing again and again throughout vampire literature, film, TV, and gaming. Yet, Carmilla would eventually be overshadowed. In 1897, Bram Stoker published Dracula. Now, Carmilla helped create the modern vampire. Dracula turned it into a cultural icon. It's difficult to overstate the influence of Stoker's novel. Much of what people imagine when they think of vampires can be traced back to Dracula, the mysterious count, the castle in Eastern Europe, the connection to bats and wolves, the boxes of native soil, the hunters pursuing an ancient evil. These elements became so influential that people now assume they have always been part of vampire mythology. What makes Dracula particularly interesting is that it arrived during a period of enormous social change. Victorian society was grappling with industrialization, scientific advancements, immigration, and shifting cultural norms. Many literary scholars have spent decades examining the anxieties reflected in the novel. Dracula himself is often viewed as an outsider entering English society and threatening the established order. He is ancient in a world becoming increasingly modern. He represents something foreign, mysterious, and difficult to control. Whether Stoker intended every interpretation attached to his novel is impossible to know, but there is little doubt that the story resonates with contemporary fears. The novel also preserves many connections to early vampire traditions. Disease remains a recurring theme throughout the story. Lucy's decline, for example, mirrors many early fears associated with vampirism. She becomes pale. She grows weaker over time. Multiple blood transfusions are attempted in order to save her. To modern readers, the imagery can feel surprisingly familiar as it echoes the same fears that once fueled the vampire panic in folklore. Stoker also expanded the vampire's abilities in many ways that would influence generations of writers. Dracula can transform into a bat, a wolf, and a mist. He can command animals. He possesses supernatural strength and hypnotic influence. Rather than drawing from a single source, Stoker assembled ideas from folklore, history, superstition, and earlier literature into one remarkable, effective character. One detail that surprises people involves sunlight. Modern audiences are accustomed to vampires bursting into flames the moment sunlight touches them. The image is so common that many assume that it originated with Dracula himself. It didn't. In the novel, Dracula can move during daylight hours. However, his powers are diminished and he is not as his strongest. No, they're not supposed to sparkle. Anyway, I'll get to that in a minute. But sunlight does not destroy him. The now famous weakness to sunlight developed later through adaptations and eventually became one of the most recognizable rules in vampire fiction. There is something that happens repeatedly through vampire history. The elements that many people assume are ancient often turn out to be surprisingly modern. The vampire has never been just one fixed creature. Every generation changes it. Every storyteller adds something new. The same can be true about the famous connection between vampires and werewolves. Modern audiences are so accustomed to seeing them as rivals, largely thanks to films, TVs, and video games. Historically, however, the relationship is far more complicated. In some traditions, the lines between vampire and werewolf folklore is surprisingly blurry. Both creatures are associated with transformation, disruption of natural order, fears surrounding what happens when humanity gives way to something else. This overlap would eventually become fertile ground for modern storytellers, but we'll save that discussion for a whole nother episode where werewolves are its own little rabbit hole. Because y'all know me, I'm going to go down that rabbit hole. For now, what matters most is at the end of the 19th century, the modern vampire has finally taken shape. The creature that began as folklore, superstition, and attempts to explain the unknown has become one of literature's most enduring figures. The next transformation would be even more dramatic. For centuries, vampire stories focused on people trying to stop the monster.
All right, that's it. Dishonor. Dishonor.
Wait a
on your
minute,
whole
why are
family.
we dishonoring
They know
me?
this. Dishonor on you. Dishonor on your cow.
That's rude. The 20th century would begin to ask a very different question. What if the vampire was telling the story? Ma! Wow. Wow. Alright. So, for most of vampire history, the vampire existed as the antagonist. Whether it appeared in folklore, superstition, or literature, the creature was something to fear. The story focuses on the victim.
Gentlemen, we are dealing with someone here who has absolutely no life.
Well, of course not. We're talking about my favorite rabbit hole. So, yeah, I have no life. The stories typically focus on the victims, survivors, and the hunters. Even in Dracula, one of the most famous vampire novels ever written, the Count remains largely an outside force acting upon the lives of others. During the 20th century, however, that began to change. Writers became increasingly invested in the vampire itself. Rather than asking how to destroy the monster, they started asking what would it be like to be the monster? What would immortality actually feel like? What would happen if someone, after decades, centuries, or even a millennia of existence, could a vampire retain its humanity? Would it want to? No writer influenced that shift more than Anne Rice. When Interview with the Vampire was published in 1976, it fundamentally changed the way many people viewed vampires. Looking back, it is very difficult to imagine modern vampire fiction without her influence. The sympathetic, introspective vampire that dominates most of contemporary media owes a tremendous debt to Anne Rice. What made her work different was the perspective. Instead of viewing vampires from the outside, readers experienced the story through the eyes of Louis de Pointe-du-Lac. Suddenly, the vampire was no longer a distant monster lurking in the shadows. He was the narrator. He was the protagonist. He was the one who was asking questions. And these questions were deeply human. What does it mean to live forever? How do you cope with watching everyone you love grow old and die? Can morality survive immortality? What happens when your existence no longer fits within the normal boundaries of human life? These questions were not about vampires. These were questions about people. The shift is one of the reasons Anne Rice's work remains so influential. Her vampires are powerful and dangerous, but those qualities are rarely the focus. Instead, she uses immortality as a lens through which to examine philosophy, identity, loneliness, purpose, and passage of time. Louis wrestles constantly with morality and guilt. Lestat approaches immortality from an entire different perspective, embracing survival, ambition, and adaptation. Claudio represents one of the most disturbing concepts in vampire fiction, a mind that continues to mature while trapped forever within a body of a child. Armand offers another perspective, forcing readers to consider questions of faith, devotion, and meaning. What fascinates me about Anne Rice's novels is that they feel less like supernatural creatures and more like people trying to navigate impossible circumstances. The vampire becomes a vehicle for exploring aspects of humanity that are difficult to examine under normal conditions. The influence of Anne Rice can still be felt through modern vampire fiction. Many of these themes she explored become staples to the genre. The idea of vampires might be tragic. The idea that immortality could be a burden rather than a gift. The idea that a monster could be worthy of sympathy. Perhaps most importantly, she helped establish the idea that vampires' greatest conflict may not be external. It could be internal. That idea will continue evolving through the late 20th century, eventually finding one of its most influential expressions in a TV series that, despite its title, was never just about vampires. Y'all already know what I'm finna say. That series was Buffy the Vampire Slayer. When people discuss Buffy's influence on popular culture, it's easy to focus on the vampires themselves. Angel, Spike, Darla, Drusilla. They remain some of the most recognizable vampire characters ever created. But before discussing them, it's important to understand why Buffy herself mattered. Traditionally, young women in horror stories were often portrayed as the victims. They were the ones being chased, hunted, or rescued. Buffy Summers completely overturned that formula. She wasn't someone waiting for somebody to save her. She was the one carrying the stake. That shift helped redefine not only vampire fiction, but supernatural storytelling in general. The series used vampires, demons, monsters to explore real-world struggles while still functioning as an entertaining supernatural drama. Relationships, identity, responsibility, growing up, and personal sacrifice all became central themes. The monsters often served as metaphors for problems that audiences recognized from their own lives. Buffy's contribution to vampire lore is enormous. One of the clearest examples is how the now iconic image of a vampire turning to dust when killed. Early vampire stories often left behind a corpse. Some required elaborate rituals, others varied depending on the mythology. Buffy popularized the visual of instant dusting to such an extent that many people assume it has always been a part of vampire folklore. Clearly, it has not. And just as many aspects of vampire mythology, it's another evolution. What makes Buffy so important, however, is how it approached morality. Angel's story evolves around redemption. Burdened by the memories of the atrocities committed as Angelus, he spends much of his existence trying to atone for the actions that can never really truly be undone. His struggle asks whether someone who has done terrible things could ever become someone better. Spike approaches the exact same question, but from a different angle. When it came to Angel, he didn't really have a choice. He was cursed with his soul. Spike, however, his journey focused less on guilt and more on choice. He chose to regain his soul. Can someone change because they generally want to change? Can a person choose to become better than they were before? Then there is Darla, whose story repeatedly challenged assumptions about identity, mortality, and sacrifice. Through her, the series explores ideas that early vampire fictions rarely considered. Drusilla, meanwhile, remains one of the franchise's most tragic figures, a reminder that some of the most frightening monsters began as victims themselves. Taken all together, these characters demonstrate something remarkable. Hi, sweet girl. Can I finish this? Can I finish this, please? Okay. Sorry, she was licking my nose. The series was never really asking whether vampires were good or evil. It was asking whether people could choose what they wanted to become. That question would go on to influence countless stories that followed. By the time the 21st century arrived, the vampire had become one of the most flexible figures in fiction. Writers could use it to tell horror stories, romance stories, action stories, philosophical stories, family dramas, and character studies. Few franchises demonstrate that evolution better than Castlevania. One of the reasons I wanted to include Castlevania in this discussion is because it occupies a unique place in vampire history and my soul. Unlike many modern adaptations, Castlevania does not simply just borrow vampire imagery. It pulls from the centuries of folklore, literature, religion, mythology, and early vampire fiction, combining them into something that feels familiar and entirely on its own. When people think Castlevania today, they immediately think the animated series. While the show does deserve its praise it receives, because I've done that praise, it is fantastic, the story actually begins much earlier. The original game released in 1986 and introduced players to a conflict that became the foundation of the franchise, the struggle between the Belmont family and Dracula. What makes Castlevania particularly interesting is the way it treats Dracula. In many stories, the vampire is simply a villain to be defeated. Castlevania certainly begins there. Early versions of Dracula function largely as the embodiment of evil, a dark lord commanding monsters and threatening humanity. As the series evolved, however, the character becomes far more complex. Rather than presenting Dracula as evil for the sake of being evil, later entries explore the grief and suffering that helped create him. The death of Lisa, his wife, becomes one of the most defining moments in the mythology. His war against humanity is born not simply from cruelty, but from loss, anger, and despair. Now, that doesn't excuse his actions, but it does make them seem more understandable. And that's something we see, again, repeatedly in vampire fiction. Writers become less interested in creating monsters and more interested in understanding them. Castlevania also preserves many elements that can be traced back to earlier vampire traditions. Dracula commands creatures of the night. He is associated with wolves, bats, darkness, and supernatural power. All of these ideas are connected directly to folklore and to Bram Stoker's Dracula. The franchise doesn't invent these concepts so much as it expands upon them. Another reason Castlevania remains so influential is the character of Alucard. Alucard exists in a position that many vampire stories find compelling. He's caught between two worlds, neither fully human nor fully vampire. He is what you would call a Dhampir. He constantly struggles with questions of identity, belonging, and responsibility. If Dracula represents surrendering to hatred, Alucard represents the possibility of resisting it. His story explores the same question that appeared in Buffy. Can someone choose to be the kind of person they want to become? Or can they choose, right? As vampires evolved through the 20th and early 21st centuries, another trend emerged. Writers became increasingly interested in exploring what immortality would do to relationships and family. This brings us to the Vampire Diaries, and more importantly for our discussion, the originals. Now, at its core, the originals is less a story about vampires and more a story about family. The Michelsons are immortal. but their struggles are surprisingly familiar. Loyalty, resentment, jealousy, forgiveness, responsibility, and love all become magnified when people have centuries rather than decades to hold grudges. Klaus Michelson is one of the most compelling examples of this. He is powerful, intelligent, and often ruthless. He is also deeply insecure, desperate for acceptance, and is shaped by wounds that never fully heal. What makes Klaus fascinating is not his power. It's the contradiction between the image he projects and the person he often tries to hide. Elijah represents a different response to immortality. He clings to honor, duty, and family. Rebecca longs for an ordinary life that she will never truly possess. Each member of the family responds differently to the burden of eternity, which is one of the reasons the series resonates with so many viewers. What I particularly appreciate about the franchise is that it adapts to older vampire traditions. Earlier, I mentioned while we were talking about anti-vampire practices and the use of wooden stakes, and how historically different regions favored different woods, including hawthorn, ash, and oak. The purpose was often to pin the vampire to the earth and prevent it from returning. The originals take this concept and transforms it into the white oak stake. Rather than being a one anti-vampire weapon among many, it becomes the single object capable of permanently killing an original vampire. It's a perfect example of modern storytelling taking on a folklore idea and expanding it into an entire mythology. At this point in vampire history, a creature that has become capable of carrying almost any story a writer wants to tell. Horror, romance, action, philosophy, family drama, political intrigue. The vampire continues adapting because it continues providing a framework in which creators can explore different aspects of the human experience. That flexibility might be one of the reasons audiences continue connecting with new vampire characters. One of the most recent examples is Astarion from Baldur's Gate 3. Astarion's popularity surprised a lot of people, but when you look at the history of vampire fiction, it makes perfect sense. He represents another stage in the evolution of the vampire archetype. At first glance, he possesses many of the traits audiences have come to expect. He's charismatic, he's witty, he's attractive, he's dangerous. Those characteristics fit comfortably within a tradition stretching from Carmilla to Lestat to Spike. What makes him compelling, however, is what lies beneath the surface. In his lore, for 2 centuries, Astarion existed under the control of Cazador. He was manipulated, abused, and stripped of agency. When characters first meet him, much of his personality is built around survival. His charm, his confidence, and his humor often function as a protective armor rather than genuine self-assurance. The deeper players travel into his story, the more they discover that his central conflict is not really about power. It's about freedom. For perhaps the first time in centuries, he has the ability to make his own choices. The question becomes, what will he do with that freedom? Will he repeat the cycle of abuse and domination that shaped his life, or will he become something different? What makes Astarion such an effective modern vampire is that his story reflects concerns that resonate strongly with contemporary audiences. Early generations often used vampires to explore disease, death, temptation, and immortality. Astarion's story explores autonomy, recovery, and long-term effects of trauma. In many ways, he demonstrates just how adaptable the vampire has become. The creature that once served as an explanation for disease now serves as a lens through which people examine identity, survival, and personal growth. After thousands of years of evolution, that might be the vampire's greatest strength, that it never stays the same for very long. Before wrapping things up, I just want to briefly touch on one final aspect of vampire culture, because I think it says a lot about the mythology and where it stands today. For most of this episode, we've discussed vampires as folklore, historical figures, literary characters, and fictional creations. Yet, unlike many supernatural creatures, vampires eventually escape the boundaries of their own stories and become part of the real world culture. One of the best examples of this is New Orleans. Few cities have become closely associated with vampires in the modern imagination. Part of that connection comes from history. Part of that comes from architecture, cemeteries, and atmosphere. Part of that comes from tourism and storytelling. And part of it comes from Anne Rice, whose work helped cement New Orleans as one of the most recognizable locations in vampire fiction. Also, in the originals, majority of the story takes place in New Orleans. What's interesting is that people don't visit New Orleans just because they expect to find actual vampires lurking in the French Quarter. They visit because the mythology itself has become a part of the city's identity. These stories have become just as important as these creatures. I think that says something important about how vampire folklore has evolved. At some point, vampires stopped being explanations. They stopped being warnings. They stopped being creatures that people generally feared. Instead, they became stories that people wanted to explore. That evolution helps explain why vampires became so closely linked to romance. If you were to walk into a bookstore today, you would find vampires appearing everywhere, from horror novels to fantasy epics to romance series. While other supernatural creatures certainly appear in romantic stories, vampires seem uniquely suited for them. Part of that comes from the nature of the mythology itself. Vampires combine danger and attraction in a way that few creatures can. They are often portrayed as powerful yet vulnerable, monstrous yet human, frightening yet sympathetic. They exist in a space filled with contradictions, and these contradictions create interesting stories. Most importantly, vampires allow writers to exaggerate emotions and experiences beyond normal human limits. Love can last for centuries. Rivalries can span generations. Regret can follow someone for eternity. Loyalty, obsession, devotion, betrayal, and sacrifice can all be explored on a scale that ordinary human stories often cannot reach. That doesn't mean that every vampire story is romantic, of course. Some are horror stories, some are tragedies, some are adventures, some are mysteries. Yet, even when the genre changes, the vampire remains surprisingly adaptable. And maybe that's the thing I've enjoyed the most while putting this episode together. The deeper I went, the harder it became to answer what should be a very simple question. What is a vampire? And the answer changes depending on where you want to look. A vampire can be a spirit, a corpse, a monster, a villain, a hero, a survivor, a warning, a tragedy, a love story, a metaphor, and yet somehow all of these answers can be correct at the same time. The more history I read, the more folklore I explored, and the more stories I revisited, the more I realized that vampires never really belong to one single culture, one single author, or one single interpretation. They've been evolving for thousands of years. And honestly, I think that's why people keep returning to them. Because there's not one definite version. There isn't. Every generation decides what a vampire means. Some generations decide if they sparkle, some generations decide that they don't. I am not one of those that decides that they should sparkle. If history is any indication, the next generation will probably reinvent them all over again. Please God, I hope not. For a creature that's supposed to be undead, it has a pretty impressive track record. And on that note, I think we will leave the vampires in their coffins for tonight until at least the next rabbit hole. So, that is the end of our episode tonight. For those who are here, you know what? Tell me what you think. Like, did you enjoy learning about vampires in the way that I do? When I was writing this episode, I absolutely love vampires. It's one of my favorite things. I've loved vampires since I was a kid. I can't tell you how many times I've read Dracula. I can't tell you how many times I have explored different things about vampires, and that when I was making sure I got all the information correct on this, it was very, very important to me on that. Now, I did forget to mention Nosferatu. Nosferatu is one of the reasons that sunlight was associated with being like insta-death, right? And the funny thing about Nosferatu, realistically, is it was an adaptation of Dracula that was not approved. The German movie did ask for permission to make a Dracula movie, and they were denied. So they did it anyway. But Count Olaf was the earliest on-screen version of Dracula. So there's that. Nosferatu is terrifying to me, to be honest. And that fits into how not all vampires are attractive or beautiful. He is absolutely terrifying. Like, no. Like, that man is terrifying. So, like, my favorite vampires clearly is Astarion and Angel. And Luke Evans is Dracula, or Vlad, in Dracula Untold. That was a very good movie, because the first, like, I'm gonna say first 10 minutes of that movie is historically, like, actually has historical things to it, because he was fighting the, Turkish Empire and everything else. Hi, sweet girl. What you doing? Am I not loving on you enough? Alright, well, I could continue and do other stuff if y'all want me to, or we can end it for tonight. It's up to y'all. It doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter to me, because either way, after either I end this and I continue gaming, or I continue gaming anyway. So, like, it really doesn't matter. I know that my dog wants my attention. Can I help you? She is, like, all up in my business. The reason I'm leaning away in my chair with my avatar is because I'm trying to get away from my dog. She is, like, all up on me. Hi, sweet girl. Hi, sweet girl. Alright, so I'm just going to end it here. And then I will come back. And we will do some gaming. So, stick around. So yeah, next week is going to be a whole new episode. I think I'm going to do true crime next week. I haven't decided what I'm going to do yet. So, stay tuned. Anyway, guys, don't go away.